Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with Research Methods, and here I'm sharing with you our research ethics lecture. So this is a little bit of a longer lecture, but it gives you the detail, history, and background that you need to complete your assignment. So you can split this up into parts and listen to it in different segments. In the car, folding laundry, it doesn't bother me, I promise. So I'm kind of more casual and just trying to give you some of the details behind the concepts. I got my tie-dye shirt on, so feel free to just kind of hunker down and give it a listen. I'll provide videos and some PowerPoint slides to assist you as well. So let's plunge in. So ethics in research have developed over time, over a series of tragedies, really, and they have major principles that have emerged, like respect, justice, and benefits. So we have to think about respect for persons, whether the research is justified, and what benefits there are to doing it. And we always think about the costs as well, especially if human beings are involved, and what impact it has on their lives before, during, and after the study. So there are a number of landmark studies that have occurred over time that have started to bring to pass these ethical standards. So the first is the Nazi medical experiments in concentration camps during World War II. So these experiments occurred between 1939 and 1945, and it included exposing prisoners to harmful gases, infecting them with diseases, immersing them in ice water, placing them in compression chambers deprived of oxygen, and cutting them with slivers of glass. How scary is that? So from 1945 to 1947, as the war ended, the individuals and physicians involved and responsible for the treatment of these prisoners were tried in international courts. The verdict from the trial included a section called Permissible Medical Experiments, which is now known as the Nuremberg Code. So the trial occurred in Nuremberg, Germany, and it started to document what is allowed and not allowed in experiments on the human condition, regardless of being a prisoner or not. The second one is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and I realize you probably have heard of these in a few other classes, so this might be a bit of a review. At the Tuskegee University in Alabama, there was a 40-year study of how syphilis progressed over time. So there were 600 men, mostly African-American men, some of which had the disease before the study began and some of which did not. But overall, the men were deceived, told they were being treated for bad blood, which was a local term for various illnesses that included syphilis, anemia, and fatigue, but they didn't know what they had. The men were given free medical care, meals, and free burial insurance for participating in the study, so if they did essentially pass away, they could have their funeral covered. But after funding for treatment was actually lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never actually be treated. None of the men infected were ever told they had the disease, and none were treated with penicillin even after the antibiotic became proven for the treatment of syphilis. So this 40-year study was controversial for many reasons relating to ethical standards, because the researchers knowingly failed to treat patients appropriately after the validation of penicillin. So we can't withhold treatment in the name of science as a cure for somebody because we're doing a study. But there were a lot of other things they did as well. You have to be very careful with deception in research because of the harm that it can create. In 1972, Philip Zimbardo did the Stanford prison experiment. That was in the psychology department, and many ethical issues came to light. So now studies require informed consent, a communication of diagnosis, accurate reporting of test results, and these previous studies and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment brought forward the Belmont Report, which basically puts forward ethical guidelines as to how to go about research, and the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protection. It also led to federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards, or basically panels of faculty that oversee all research that occurs at their respective universities, to protect human subjects in studies involving them. We're going to talk more about IRBs in a moment. But let's get back to Stanford. What happened there? So in the 70s, Dr. Zimbardo had a bunch of psych students mostly and gave them random social roles and had kind of a mini prison in the basement of the psychology department. And he assigned these random roles. You're going to be a prisoner, you're going to be a guard, and we're going to do this mini prison. And essentially he wanted to study how social roles influence behavior and how people can justify treating people different ways. The guards became aggressive whenever a prisoner was disobedient. Prisoners faced increased psychological and physical harm. Some were deprived of food and yelled at all day, and the guards' actions progressed, and they actually had to shut down the whole study after 3 days because the students got out of hand. But the ethical concern was for the welfare of the participants, especially the prisoners. The guards basically had the power go to their heads, and the prisoners had a lack of freedom and dehumanization, and they really started to panic and worry about what would happen to them because of things getting so intense. Finally, we have Stanley Milgram's experiments on obedience to authority. So throughout history, often we have one central leader and people obey that leader. And he wanted to see what it took to get people to obey leaders, even though they were knowingly doing something wrong or harmful, obeying authority blindly. So this had important questions with implications for knowledge, preventing vulnerabilities to certain authorities who might take advantage of people. But this experiment that occurred in the 1960s was staged. It was actually fake to make people think that they were causing harm by administering electric shock, but in reality nothing was really happening. It was all faked. This is a classic study that happened at Yale University where Milgram was the authority figure, and there were two people in the study. One person was a teacher and was administering a test, and the other person was a learner. And the teacher would ask these word pairs, and the learner was supposed to choose the right answer. And for each incorrect response, the teacher was told by Milgram, the authority figure, to administer shocks to the learner in increments of 15 electrical volts. Now, in reality, no shocks were ever administered, but for every wrong answer, they increased the voltage. And they recorded people screaming and crying, and the person could hear it, and they were wondering if everything was okay. The results to this experiment were astonishing. 100% of the participants shocked the learner up to 300 volts, and 2/3, a little more than that, 65% of participants actually shocked their learner the maximum, 450 volts, which is enough to kill a human being. Although no shocks were ever administered, people were kind of traumatized by participating in this, administering pain and facing a lot of moral conflict and a lot of stress. They pleaded with Milgram to stop the experiment, even though Milgram told them they had to continue, and it was in the name of science, and it was really important for them to finish their protocol. It was a little bit too much, and we had to say, wait a second, when are we pushing human beings too far? So all these studies have different themes in them, but that's just a quick overview of some of what we learned about the boundaries of ethics. So the historical background for the Nuremberg Code we already went over. It said, hey, you can't just do experiments on people in the name of science. Okay, and then eventually the Belmont Report was created as we continue to have problems, and respect for persons, beneficence, and justice have been the pillars. Okay, so there is this chart. I realize it might be a tricky bit tough to read, but I'll briefly go over some of what we learned, the 10 directives from the Nuremberg Code. So these are just kind of brief, and they tell you some of how we protect people. So first, voluntary consent of the human subject is essential. I have to know what I'm getting myself into in your study. Number two, the study should have fruitful results that would not be available any other way and not random or unnecessary in nature. Number three, it should be designed so that anticipated results will justify the experiment. The experiment should also be conducted to avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. No experiment should be conducted where there's a reason to believe that death or disabling injury should occur. 6, the degree of risk taken should never exceed that determined by humanitarian importance of the problem. So no one's life is worth, in the name of science, justification. Number 7, proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect subjects, even against remote possibilities of injury or death. Number 8, the experiment should only be conducted by scientifically qualified people. Number 9, during the course of the experiment, if somebody wants to quit or say, I've had enough, they should have the liberty to be able to end the experiment. And number 10, the scientists in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if they have good cause to believe that it would be in detriment to the people involved. So you can imagine these were really important directives that came about. Okay, so let's talk about institutional review boards. So I will come back to the screen for a moment. I'm in the middle of an institutional review board review where I'm actually doing research with first responders or law enforcement on responses to terrorism, trying to determine lessons learned and strategies that have come forward in counterterrorism practice, intelligence sharing, prevention, and certainly response to attacks. So I'm actually going to Great Britain and talking to responders in the UK because especially in the last 5 to 10 years, Europe has been pummeled with attacks, and I'm looking to see if there anything that they can share with us that would be useful to practitioners going forward. So I'm undergoing this institutional review board to make sure that my study, interviewing cops, is ethical, and I don't do any harm to them, that I maintain their confidentiality, that I make sure that I don't create any experiences that might cause them suffering, harm, or kind of mental disturbance or PTSD or things like that. I have to make sure that, again, I keep their confidentiality and that I disclose my results to them when I'm done. And there's just a lot of different things I have to do to make sure that when I'm finished, I haven't harmed anybody and that my research subjects are informed and aware of what I'd like to talk to them about, and so on and so forth. So that's my current experience with an IRB. But what are these IRBs? Let's talk about them. So they are essentially committees of faculty that review research proposals to ensure that we're abiding by ethical principles. It's required for every institution that is federally funded for biomedical or behavioral research on people, and the members of these boards are faculty kind of chosen, and they rotate every so many years. I was actually in consideration for a rotation at one point in time where we have diverse backgrounds and experiences that can help determine whether or not ethics are being followed. So your university's IRB sets the human protection standards, and because of this, it's important to review those guidelines and guidelines of any association you're with if you're going to do research on behalf of another entity. Make sure you review those guidelines. So ASA, the American Sociological Association, has professional ethics guidelines, as does ASC, the American Society of Criminology, and you're supposed to use that and proceed accordingly. So upon approval of your IRB or your committee that reviews your plan and protocol, you outline the details of your study, and you can go forward with your work. And then after you're finished, you report back and make sure you provide accurate information concerning the research, how it went, and that you adhered to these ethical standards. So this is a little graph about IRBs. So you basically have the review process, you receive approval, you gain your informed consent, making sure people know that are participating in your study what the benefits are, if there's any compensation involved, what the procedures are going to be, and then that they are offered a professional debriefing if needed. But let's talk about what these are individually. So first, informed consent is a signed or verbal agreement where the participant in your study states they're willing to participate after being informed of all aspects of their role. So they have to be fully informed. Assent is consent of a minor or other legally incapable person, like an inmate, that agrees to participate in a study after receiving an appropriate explanation in a reasonably understandable language. So sometimes when we study kids, they might not really understand, and we have to get informed consent from their parents. So there are certain populations that informed consent can be tricky, and we have certain populations that are heavily protected, that we will talk about that as well, because sometimes they might feel coerced or compelled to be in the study for certain benefits that aren't really there, and we don't want people to freely give their will and choice to be involved. So participants have to be told the purpose of the research, the expected duration, the procedures you're going to use, their right to decline or withdraw, and any foreseeable consequences for withdrawing or declining. They also have to be told of any potential risks of participation, any limits of confidentiality that you anticipate, incentives of participation, and information with who to contact if you feel that your rights have been violated. For a moment, I'm going to go back. We're going to talk about deception in research. Some studies use deception or lying to deliberately withhold the truth or maybe passively omit key information because it's actually part of what's being tested in the study. So you can do that, but you have to make sure that the deception is absolutely necessary and that you can use non-deceptive alternatives. If that's not feasible, that you have to do it. There's no reasonable expectation for causing pain or severe emotional distress to the person. And they're informed of the deception at the earliest possible moment, but no later than the end of data collection. So sometimes we're testing people, their behavior by not knowing something, and so occasionally we do deceive, but we have to make sure it's not at a harmful cost. We also have our ethical principles of achieving valid results. So we need to have our goal of obtaining objective data, having honesty and openness. Publication is a big part of that, to have our work reviewed by other professionals. It's vital to making sure that everything was done properly, protecting our research participants that we talk with or observe or survey or whatever we're going to do, that we avoid harm, get the informed consent, avoid deception except in limited circumstances, and maintain their privacy. So we always consider the uses of research so that benefits outweigh risks. Achieving valid results, we have to be committed to making sure that our validity of our study needs to be done is our critical starting point. And we need to be objective and make sure we don't have any biases that might taint the research or the selection of people. It's hard to do truly unbiased science, but we try to be as careful as we possibly can. So with honesty and openness, researchers should disclose their method, present their findings, publish their results, and acknowledge the source of funding so that people can make sure that it's not being compromised. And this is hard to do because sometimes your findings are not what you hoped they would be, and you really don't want to publish it because you're disappointed, and that happens, but we're still supposed to move forward with our results we actually got. So again, avoiding harm to our research participants, obtaining informed consent, and children have to be given assent or a legal guardian's informed consent. So again, we have to protect the identity of a person in our study, even those involved in a study, but not directly. And we make sure that the identity of the person is only available to the study staff and on a limited basis. Okay, so these are the special populations I mentioned before. There are certain groups that we have to be very careful of working with. So first is prisoners, again, because they can be coerced to being involved in research. The second is pregnant women, particularly because of unknown effects to the fetus. And then we have mentally disabled persons or mentally incapacitated persons. We have to be very careful about them. And educationally or economically disadvantaged people. Again, just not really being as aware or mindful of what is occurring in the study because they don't have the proper knowledge to understand. So we have to make sure that we speak in terms that they can deal with, and especially with children too. So that's kind of another protection. We very much safeguard studies with kids in them. So again, avoid deception in research except in limited circumstances, and that you debrief the study, answering questions they have, or referring them to the proper people should they have any emotional distress or concerns. Here we have our anonymity and confidentiality, and a lot of people mix these up and they're trying to kind of say, okay, wait, which is which and what's the difference? Because we use them interchangeably. So anonymity is protecting an individual's identity where the identity of our participant remains unknown throughout the study, even to the study staff. Nobody knows who they are. It's completely blind. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is protecting that identity where the identity of participant is not made available to anyone except those study staff, the people directly involved in the study for research purposes. So that's kind of the difference. Anonymous means nobody, not even the professor, the scientist, the researcher, the primary investigator. No one knows who you are. It's completely blind. Confidentiality means I know who you are, but I'm the only one that's going to know. Okay, a few more concepts and we'll be wrapping up soon. So we have integrity, the extent to which a researcher is honest and truthful in his or her actions and values methods, measures, and dissemination of the research. We truthfully report and never fabricate our research results by making up data that were never observed or measured. And this has happened in the past where people lose dissertations, they lose licenses, they get expelled from universities, blacklisted, and they're not allowed to conduct research ever again. So this has actually happened in the past. Scientific integrity also includes plagiarism, making sure that you're not taking credit for someone else's work, and being given publication credit, where people who make substantial contributions to your work are studied, are recognized as authors of that work and given recognition. With publication, we don't want to duplicate the publication of data, meaning the same work should never be published twice without identifying what is being republished and why, so we don't want to create confusion in the field. And then sharing research for verification. Researchers are expected to share their data upon request from others for purposes of inspection, reanalysis, and replication to make sure you found what you really found. And we can replicate a study and make sure that we are observing the same phenomenon and that your findings are not just coincidental or unique when you did it. Part of scientific integrity also includes reviewers. So as a part of this process, peer reviewers can sometimes have access to information that should be protected, but ASA, again, American Sociological Association, the APA, American Psych Association, and ASC, these codes of conduct require that peer reviewers respect confidentiality and the property rights of people who submit their work. So we do have certain rights of what work we can safeguard. And essentially, peer review is a scientific procedure that we use to review a manuscript or work by experts in that area that know it well and can determine its scientific value or worth regarding publication. And they're very, very hard on the authors, making sure that the study is worthwhile, that they did it correctly. And so we kind of hold ourselves to high standards in the peer review process. The uses of research: when we conduct our research on behalf of an organization, there might be other controls that we have to think about in the final report and how it's publicized. And then, do you believe personal values should be present in social research? Most scientists say they should be left outside the lab. Some feel it's proper or necessary for them to be able to discern right and wrong procedures or concern themselves with the way research is being used. So some people say that's my moral compass and I can't divorce myself from it, and other people say no, it's going to bias your study. So I think it's challenging to do truly value-free research because you basically have to not have a conscience. But it is tricky navigating personal values in social research. You're going to have feelings about who you're studying and what you're studying. So we have to consider how this is going to impact our research and think about anything we may need to withhold, like beneficial treatment. If that comes up into play, we have to make sure that that's justified. Most of the time it is not, so you have to be very careful. Again, here's that research with children. They can't legally provide their own consent, so they have to have active parental consent. But we may allow passive consent by an IRB depending on the situation, meaning they can participate as long as there is not a lack of consent on behalf of the parent. So a child is anyone under 18 years old that we believe cannot actively understand what they're getting themselves into, so we require the guardians and parents to be involved. And then finally, research with prisoners. This is our very last part of our research ethics lecture. They are under constraints which could affect their ability to consent because they're incarcerated, for crying out loud, right? So a prisoner means someone who's involuntarily confined or detained in some kind of penal institution. And it encompasses people sometimes in state hospitals or in alcohol and drug treatment facilities, in probation or parole, under court order, work release programs, or in group homes or at-home detention programs. And so when you're restricted or involuntarily confined or supervised, we have to understand that you might feel like you have to participate in the study as a term of your confinement, and that's not right either. So this is something we have to think about a lot in criminology because we do research with prisoners, and we have to make sure we respect their humanity and not do anything unjust like we saw with our counterparts in Nazi Germany. So that's it. That's basically research ethics in a nutshell. So make sure you check out those videos and review the slides. I tried to keep this under 25 minutes so it wasn't too painful. But again, I hope you enjoy our quick tour of research ethics and some of the history and standards that have come to pass. If If you have any other questions, please let me know. I know this was very quick and I was talking very fast, but again, hopefully you found it useful. Have a great week.